Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 7, Sunday, October 16, 2016. The lesson is entitled The Great High Priest. The lesson comes from Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through chapter 5, verse 10. We were asked to read the same. The place is unknown. The time is about 67 AD. This week's passage focuses on the important truth that Jesus Christ was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Hebrews 4:15. Use this lesson to affirm the sinlessness of Christ. It is not that Christ could not have sinned but did not. Rather, Christ could not have sinned because he was holy, sinless in his essential nature. Theologians call this the impeccability of Christ. We are thankful for this truth, for if Christ had sinned, he would not have qualified to bear our sin. Today's aim. Facts. To understand Jesus' role as the great high priest who can help all believers. Principle. To recognize how Jesus as the great high priest is superior to human high priests. Application. To come to Jesus Christ, the great high priest, in times of difficulty. Illustrating the lesson. We can come at any time to our great high priest. Golden text reads, Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed unto the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. Hebrews 4:14. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first, encouragement from Christ's high priesthood, Hebrews 4:14 through 16. The second is qualifications of high priest, Hebrews 5:1 through 4. And the third is high priestly qualifications of Christ, Hebrews 5:5 through 10. Introduction. Priesthood is an institution in almost all religions of the world. Though the functions of priests have varied from one religion to another, they all attempt to bridge the gap between the earthly sphere of humans and the deity of deities they represent. This involves some form of mediation between weak, sinful mankind and the deity. Priesthood was thus a feature of not only ancient Israel, but also its surrounding neighbors. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was considered the high priest of every god, but he was assisted by powerful priesthood. The Mesopotamian civilizations, Assyria, Babylonian, and Persia, all had their priestly castes, as did Hinduism in India. The most prominent spiritual priesthood was that of Aaron, which God ordained to mediate for Israel and offer sacrifices for sins. As the book of Hebrews points out, however, this was but a foreshadowing of the ministry of the great priesthood of Jesus Christ. Encouragement from Christ's high priesthood. Hebrews 4:14. Seeing that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. Verse 15. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Verse 16. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. His identification with us. Hebrews 4:14 through 15. The author of Hebrews had previously alluded to the high priesthood of Christ in chapter 2, verses 17 through chapter 3, verse 1. But he had turned from this theme to give a warning, lest his readers fail to enter the spiritual rest God intended for them. Chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. Now with the word, seeing then, 4:14, he returned to it and began to expound Christ's priesthood more thoroughly. He affirmed that Christian believers have a great high priest. The fact that Jesus is a great high priest sets him apart as superior to all other priests, particularly those of Aaron's order, a theme taken up in detail later. In addition, Jesus had passed through the heavens. Levitical high priest passed beyond the veil in the temple once a year to make an atonement. Hebrews 9:3 and 7. But Christ passed into the highest heaven and God's presence when his work was completed. Chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, 8, 1, 9, 24. Third, the great high priest is both human and divine. Jesus, the Son of God, Hebrews 4:14. His humanity is essential to his identification with those he is representing, 2:17. And his deity is essential for him to exercise his power and impart his righteousness for their forgiveness. Chapter 1 emphasizes his deity, and chapter 2 his humanity. Now they are brought together in unity. These truths about Jesus Christ are the basis for the exhortation to hold firmly to our profession or confession of faith. This idea is a key thought in Hebrews chapter 3 verses 1 and chapter 10:23. But the readers were wavering in their faith. Because of who Jesus Christ is and what he has done, they were to hold their confession to him tenaciously. To encourage him further in this, the writer assured them that Christ was aware of their struggles and temptations. It is a constant blessing that he is touched with the feeling of our infirmities, Hebrews 4:15, able to sympathize with our weaknesses. The writer used the double negative to stress this positive point because the readers were apt to think a divine person could not really understand their condition. That our text affirms is simply untrue. Jesus can identify with us in our weaknesses because in every way he was tempted just as we are, yet remanded without sin. Although God cannot be tempted by evil, James 1:13. Jesus could be tempted because he also was human. The fact that he was tempted in every respect does not mean he experienced every single temptation of every person, but that he faced every kind of temptation. Solicitation to evil dodged him his whole life, not just at the time of Satan's recorded temptations. The assurance that Jesus remained without sin includes the truth that he did not yield to temptation, but it does further. As God, he was without the ability to sin. The temptations were real, but they found in him no trigger to produce sin. 2 Corinthians 5:21. Does this make him less able to understand our temptations? By no means. For one who is sinless feels its kinness in a way of fallen being can never appreciate. In resisting to the end, he felt the full force of temptations as no sinner could ever. Our bold access through him, Hebrews 4:16. Because our high priest can so completely identify with us, we are urged to come boldly unto the throne of grace. Come speaks concisely of moving into close proximity. This is an important theme of this book. Open access to God, chapter 7:19, 25, 10:19 through 22. Christ priestly work opens the way to God's presence. We are encouraged to follow him there boldly with freedom to commune with God. God's presence is called the throne of grace, Hebrews 4:16, which speaks of two things, God's sovereignty and his freedom to dispense his favor. When we pray, we should keep both of these in mind, knowing that a sovereign God can bestow his grace only through Christ's finished work. 1:3. When we approach him, we will receive God's mercy and compassion along with his grace to help us in our time of need. He is always ready to dispense whatever help is needed. Qualifications of priest. Chapter 5, verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Verse 2. Who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. Verse 3. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sins. Verse 4. And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron, identified with humanity. Hebrews 5, 1 through 3. The author intended to deal in depth with the superiority of Christ's priesthood over Aaron's. But to do this, he had to first set forth high priestly qualifications. The first of these was that a high priest was taken from among men. Only a human being could represent other humans in things pertaining to God. Specifically, he offered both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He oversaw the ministry of expiating sin before a holy God. He shared human experience, enabled him to have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way. Hebrews 5:2. Have compassion on is a verb meaning to hold one's passions to restraint. The high priest had to steer a middle course in dealing with human weakness, being neither too lenient nor too harsh. He could do this because he saw the same weaknesses in himself. The high priest had to deal with people who were ignorant and going astray. The Old Testament law made abundant provision for atoning sacrifices for sins committed in ignorance and waywardness, Numbers 15, 24 through 29. But it made no provision for the defiant sinner, 30:31. The compassionate high priest would be able to discern the difference and emphasize with the repentant because he himself was subject to weakness. Indeed, the high priest, being human, was susceptible to sin himself and therefore had to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as the sins of others. The law made this requirement clear. Aaron and his sons had to make atonement for themselves before they could do so for the people. Leviticus 9:7. And every high priest on the annual Day of Atonement had to do the same. Leviticus 16:6, Hebrews 9:7. Thus, every high priest fully identified with the people. Though Jesus too identified with humans in their weaknesses, Hebrews 2:17 through 18, 4:15, his weaknesses did not entail moral fatality. He did not sin and therefore did not have to offer a sacrifice for himself, a fact that the author emphasized later, chapter 7, 26 through 28. In fact, Jesus would be able to give his own body and blood as an atonement for the sins of others. Chapter 9, verses 12, 10, 10. Called by God. Hebrews 5:4. A high priest had to be human, but he was not humanly appointed. No man taketh this honor unto himself. No one could arbitrarily decide to become a high priest. Old Testament history records that disaster fell on those who independently tried to take on priestly duties. Numbers 16, 2 Chronicles 26, 16 through 21. Nor were high priests chosen by election or royal appointment. A high priest had to be called by God, just as Aaron was. This divine appointment was not only a personal one, but also included Aaron's descendants, Exodus 28:1, 1 Chronicles 23:13. Having been appointed by God, Jewish high priests were expected to carry out his revealed will. Deviation was bound to bring judgment. 1 Samuel 2:27 through 26. By the time Hebrews was written, secession to The high priesthood had become irregular and politically motivated. No longer were all high priests descendants of Aaron. Besides, corruption of all kinds permeated the office. Readers of Hebrews would have been aware of that, so the author focused on God's ideal. High priestly qualifications of Christ. Verse 5. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. Verse 6. As he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Verse 8. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Verse 9. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obeyed him. Verse 10. Called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek, ordained by the Father. Hebrews 5 through 6. From examining high priestly qualifications in general, the author began to show how Jesus Christ fulfilled them, declaring first his divine appointment. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he said that unto him, Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. Though he was the Messiah and the Son of God, Jesus did not appoint to himself the position of high priest. He awaited the appointment of his Father. A quotation from Psalms 2:7 establishes Christ's divine sonship. We have seen this used once already in Hebrews to show his superiority over angels, 1:5. And now it affirms his superiority over earthly priesthoods. Jesus has entered a heavenly sanctuary where his sacrifice is pleasing to his Father, 9:24. A second quotation from Psalms 110:4 further establishes the nature of Christ's priesthood, Hebrews 5:6. As he says, refers to God's own witness when he declared, Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. This messianic psalm first declares the Messiah's deity, verses 1 through 3, then his priesthood, verse 4, and finally his conquest, 5 through 7. Thus the offices of king and priest reside in the same person. This quotation tells us two characteristics of Christ's priesthood. First, it is forever. It is eternal because the priest himself is eternal, never to be succeeded by another. Hebrews 7:28. Second, it is based on the order of Melchizedek. The idea of an order is best understood as a precedent or pattern, for Melchizedek never established an order of priests. King priest of Abraham's day, Genesis 14. He was one of a kind and thus a fitting picture of Christ, confirmed by human suffering, Hebrews 5:7 through 9. The similarities of Melchizedek and Christ are dealt with in detail later, but the author of Hebrews preferred at this point to examine the other major qualifications of our high priest. His identification with humans in their sufferings in the days of his flesh calls attention to his earthly life and the weaknesses it entailed. Jesus' experience described here is most likely his agony in Gethsemane, though it could refer to the cross. Hebrews 5:7 further tells us that Jesus offered up to God prayers and supplications. The first of these terms is the general words for entreaties or requests. The second term is more intensive and used only here in the New Testament. It portrays the extending of an olive branch by one making supplication. Jesus accompanied his prayers with loud cries and tears. Though the gospel texts do not mention tears at Gethsemane or the cross, they would be consistent with the degree of his suffering. Jesus' prayers were offered to one who was able to save him from death. And the writer of Hebrews argued that he was heard because he showed godly reverence. We might be tempted to argue that he was not heard since he had to die, but that prayer was answered in his resurrection. Acts 2:27 through 31. Thus, Jesus' human struggles completed his preparation for the high priesthood. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Hebrews 5:8. His sonship may lead us to assume that he would not have to suffer, but suffering enabled him to learn in human experience what it meant to obey God. Matthew 26:39 and 42, Philippians 2:6 through 8. As a son, he had always been obedient. As a man, he confirmed by obedience even unto death his fitness to be the high priest for mankind. It is in this sense also that we should interpret and being made perfect. Hebrews 5:9 to 10. The author was not implying only previous moral imperfections in Christ, but rather was speaking of his complete fitness for his high priestly ministry as a result of his human suffering. At this point, Jesus became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. He is the means of divine deliverance at every level, for sin's penalty, power, and presence forever. The key qualifier is that this is for all who obey him, that is, respond in faith to his finished work, as God has commanded. Romans 6:17. 10:16, 2 Thessalonians 1:8, called to a unique priesthood. Hebrews 5:10. The author concluded the discussion of Christ's high priestly qualifications with the summary statement that he is called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. God the Father formally proclaimed his Son to have a unique high priesthood. Being named a high priest in the order or pattern of Melchizedek carries connotations that we will explore in our next lesson. But what the author of Hebrews wanted to emphasize at this point is that we have a great high priest who has fulfilled all the qualifications expected of a priest, but he has also exceeded those qualifications and, for our sakes, has inaugurated a high priesthood that is unique. Questions. 1. Why is it essential that our great high priest be both human and divine? 2. How did Jesus' temptation compare with those we face? 3. How can we as sinners have access to God's throne of grace? 4. What course did a priest have to follow in dealing with human weaknesses? 5. How does Jesus' identification with humans differ from that of purely human priests? 6. From what ancestry did Jesus' priest have to come? Why? 7. Did Jesus seek out the high priestly office? Explain. 8. How does Christ's priesthood differ from that of Jewish priests? 9. How fully did Christ identify with human beings? 10. In what sense did Christ learn obedience? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, October 16, 2016. Thank you for listening. God bless.